This is Prairie Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And we're still in virus time, so we're trying to do things in an experimental way. Last week, I was talking about ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand National Service Corps, which had its Memorial Day on the 25th, which was the last week of this program. I thought I might add a little more to that because the Aussies and the New Zealanders have been involved in quite a few wars. I was talking to you about cavalry, and you can't imagine that it was less than 80 years ago that cavalry was still being sent to fight Rommel and in the Middle East. It used to be that you shot at each other. You had lines of pistols, and you were all in a line. It was all formal, and that broke down well before the Civil War. But things have changed, and we had a neighbor who was a farmer just across the road. He had a son that ran the farm and a daughter. I used to play tennis with the daughter. So we were quite close, and Herc Green, the father, would speak a lot of his son. His son was in the military, perhaps in college, and continued with it. He went to the Middle East. He went to Greece. He did some things in the Eastern Mediterranean for a while, then back to Australia, then to New Guinea, and then he was commissioned to be in charge of the battalion, Australian battalions that went to Korea. And he was a kind of popular guy, and he was with his troops, and his name was Charlie Green. And Charlie Green, when he came back from the Middle East, he had a respite from being in the military for a while, but he went to a little town called Almara, which by that time my father had moved from Thora, which was near to Bellingen, down the coast, and we went to Grafton, where he had another school. They were consolidating the small primary schools, so he had to move. And this is where we were. The school was right opposite Herc Green's farm, and the one son worked it, and the other son, Charlie, went to Alvar to buy himself a pen, a fountain pen. It's as interesting that in those days you actually had a pen which had ink with it, and that was popular. Some of the better brands, I can remember the Parker pen was popular. Well, he walked into the newspaper shop, and the daughter was there, and she sold him the pen. They sort of took a look at each other. She was 16 and he was probably older than that, but some years later he sent that pen back to her because he thought she ought to have some sort of memento of that occasion when he was home. Then they started to write to each other, and then not too long afterwards they were engaged, and shortly after that they were married. And so my sister sent me details of this family. the wife had known that her husband was in the military, and she was saddened when, as the military commander of the Australian troops in Korea, he got shrapnel, survived for a while, then died. And so she went to college and got a English degree in the teaching of English. But then she found that the troops that he was with were going to put together a memorial to Charlie. And she thought she didn't know very much about Charlie. So she started to do research on troops that were coming back, wounded or otherwise. And so she got a master's degree doing that at the university. And later, she was awarded the Australian equivalent of a MBE. MBE was a member of the British Empire, and now it's a member of the Australian Empire. As the various colonies have dropped off the empire, they've given their own awards, but it's the equivalent of same, which means that she created a book that reported on some of the military action that was that the average Australian doesn't, or New Zealander doesn't really run into, and so she was awarded for that. But I thought I would tell you that because that sort of suggests how close you can be to military people who do and don't come back. And Charlie Green didn't come back, but his troops were concerned enough that there should be a memorial. And so 2 years after his passing probably was when they did that, and when his wife, Olga, I think it is, decided to do research on this. So that's enough just to remind you that we do have military, and we should think about them and support them. And it's going to be a bigger problem, I think, is if the world keeps populating itself with people. There's going to be the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots will eventually challenge the haves. And it's happening a little now with migration, and so I think we're still in military time. The second thing I wanted to do was this week I went to the Pope Prairie in Rantoul. Ron Slater was coming from Decatur. We've been working together for probably 7 or more years, and he spot herbicides the teasel. Teasel is a miserable invasive species, and it has a strong root and a huge array of flowers, rosette on the ground, but then it has a stem that goes up to 8 feet tall, and it has little cups around the edge of the stem that collect water. So this creature has survival techniques, and it's all over the state, all over the Midwest. It is a miserable character, and it's very, very hard to get rid of, and it competes with the prairie that we try to preserve. So the 9-acre prairie we have is adjacent to a cemetery. Then there's a little piece of farmland, and then the Route 45 goes around the cemetery, and there's an old Route 45 which used to go behind the cemetery, and that leaves a little triangle. So that little triangle is what we've bought for prairie, because it's been mined for gravel, we have to know that this is the Bloomington Moraine, and you're as that road 45 goes up over the Bloomington Moraine, the prairie is on the left-hand side, and there's an old road behind. And it's been a prime place for people to go to, but there's also a prime candidate for dumping. And for years we've been moving everything from television sets to leftover rubbish out of there. And eventually the Department of Transportation has put up a gate to the north, and the cemetery has put up a gate to the south. So it's wonderful. We can now drive in there, lock the gate behind us, and we don't have to have a little chariot to carry water down there. We can take tools and vehicles, and very pleasing. And the cemetery's been very cooperative. And, they agreed to take the seed pods of this teasel plant and they have a burn pile. So, and the cemetery is interesting too because it's got history. It's very near to what was an Air Force base, the Chinook Air Force Base, and so if you spend a little time there, I just walked down and talked to the cemetery people because there was a lot of water coming off the top of the Bloomington Moraine, and this was after rain, and I'm tempted to do a kickstart on trying to buy 5 acres nearby between us and the cemetery. And I didn't want it to be an area where there was a lot of ponded water. So I was doing my homework, and Ron was doing his spot herbiciding. And I talked to the cemetery people and found out where the water was coming to and where it was going to. And there's one culvert under 45 which has collapsed, and that hasn't affected the road as yet, but it stops the water from going through. So the water goes from the east side of where your Route 45 is, it goes west under the old road, under the old interurban, and then it runs down beside the interurban and then ducks back again. So you have to wonder about this drainage, but it eventually goes into a drainage and goes out. So I was finding out, and I took a few photographs of the moraine. You can actually see you get an idea of the moraine, the hill of the moraine. It's not that high, but you can get a feeling for it from the cemetery. I did that and got out of the way of 2 people who came to put flowers on the grave. And I looked at an area to the south, which is always a swampland, and it would be wonderful to acquire that at some time. It's not the sort of place where you could put a Walmart or a development. You'd have to put in 6 million tons of fill to make it useful. So I was looking at that too, and then I walked back and I walked past Lyle Shields. Lyle Shields was a county board chairman, and so his family is buried there, and he is buried there. And I went to his funeral just not too long ago, it's perhaps 2 years ago, at the Lux Funeral Home. And it is interesting to get to know these people and to have them as friends. The Lux came down Market Street not too long ago, and we were talking. He had helped me to find little cemeteries that exist here and there. He owns the Lux Funeral Home. He's now passed on, and his daughter runs the funeral home. And right now they're doing funerals with cars parked outside, and one person comes in at a time to say goodbye to the person. And Lyle died a while ago, but early on when he was board chairman, I was talking to him about this plot of land and other plots of land and prairie preservation, and he was like Mayor Gilton. It was almost like, I can't touch you with a 40-foot pole, but politically. But if you, what do you want? So these people can be very, very helpful. And so I have a fond feeling for Rantoul. And that plot of land that we own could be the basis for 10 miles at Paxton, but it also comes back towards Rantoul and a pumpkin vine train that used to run from Leroy through to Fisher to Rantoul, and part of it's still open. And so there are extensions of our 9 acres, and the road could be a bicycle trail and a hiking trail. And the east-west line has been developed, and it's used. And whenever I go to my dentist there, there's a bunch of people using that trail. It's just 3 miles long, but it's the sort of thing that could have extensions, and it's interesting. And here we think we have a flat land that's not interesting, but bless me, it's loaded with microclimates and micro niches. And so I walked the prairie. When you're walking quickly, you don't sink into it. But when I took a camera and had to stand behind the camera as it was photographing, then your boots gradually fell into the clay, and you lifted up your foot came out of the boot and left the boot behind. And so I got to the point where this was wet and sloppy enough that if you were going to take a photograph, you had to be on a little mound or something. But I'm going to stand up and let you see what the Prairie looks like. It doesn't look like anything exciting if you're not into this, but if you are, then you can get your jollies at the Pope Prairie. It's called the Pope Prairie because the Pope family realized that the road went out around the cemetery, so it was a good target for visual corridor. So your headlights would shine on billboards, and the Pope family owned the Champaign billboard company, and but then somebody got bright and put in 57, which is on the west side of Rantoul, and 45 was not any longer a heavily used road. So there was no real advantage in having billboards on this corner. So we had been working with the Prairie behind there for a long time. So we were asked if we would want to buy it. We said, oh, well, yes, let's do that. So we bought what was, it was also used for a gravel pit. And you have to know that the glacial till is brought down from Canada and has been deposited in the Bloomington Moraine at a certain temperature where it melted. But the rock and rubble that was carried had been ground, and so we have good soil, but it's clay soil, and it's regrowth succession that's happening, and it'll take years. It's probably been happening. I don't know how old the gravel pit is, but I guess about 70 years. And it'll take another 70 years to get back to normal. It's filling in gradually. I'm going to stand and let you have a look at the Pope Prairie a little later in the season. There's dock. There's some cottonwoods on the left-hand side. There's cypress trees, which are a little invasive. And behind there's a row of ash tree, which has taken the emerald ash borer, and so they're dying, and they're being removed by the Department of Transportation, which owns that. They were going to put in a dual highway, and the dual highway wasn't put in because of the 57 going in, so they have some land bought there that makes this area wider. We have a nice little stream that comes down from that hole in the forest part there, and it comes down. It's an abraded stream, so you don't see it as a stream, you see it as water everywhere, which is very typical of the drainage of this area. In the front, you can see some of the broadleaves of dock. At the moment, we were there very early, and early in the season, so you don't see the leaves coming up. Yes, you do. They're tiny at the moment, and the grasses are as dead as dead, but they'll come more in June. But the plants are starting to grow. There's even some golden Alexander that's just heading out, and I found a sedge that I hadn't found before, and it doesn't have sedges don't have a flower. It's not convenient to identify it. This is tiny. It's 2 or 3 inches tall, with its head there. I once went to a field seminar with a botanist who was a specialist in sedges, and it's very hard to know how to define a sedge. It doesn't have any petals, but it's there, and it's there enough that you can see it. So it's colonizing in these little clumps that are of regrowth that are coming back to a real prairie. Give it 200 years and it'll look like a prairie, and it'll be fairly native because we're taking seed from the interurban railroad area where it's pretty natural remnant, and we're dipsy-doodling it in more or less in the nature of what we think was a remnant prairie. It's sort of a garden prairie in a way because we're working with it. And we've got to be careful we don't overseed some things that are sometimes aggressive. The grasses can be aggressive if you're not careful. A little strip, about an acre or more, was plowed for corn and soybeans. It only lasted a couple of years. Planting agronomic plants in a soil that it's not got its organic matter and is not awfully exciting. So it doesn't really yield very well. So it's going back into prairie, and it's adjacent to the road. So we have to dipsy-doodle a little seed in there occasionally to make sure people don't think that this is a weedy patch that's not prairie. It's weedy. We're losing the weeds. It's not enough to burn. There's not enough fuel matrix there to burn. But baptisia and rosinweed and clovers are growing now. We've had students and others there that have prepared seed and then gone sowing it. We're very, very pleased that the four-wheelers haven't found it as a mud place. It is muddy. The muddy makes that burrow pit or gravel pit wonderful because the glacial till along with the clay makes the gravel that they take out of there a very good road pack. So 8 feet of glacial till has been removed there. So, but what's left along with the water is a prime target for someone to get an old pickup truck and sit in the middle of the mud pool and spin them. And then sometimes they tow each other out. And, so the site has had some of that sort of activity. Haven't had it a lot for the last 15 years. We've had one about 2 years ago. You've got to watch the off-road bicycles. They can find their way into that 9 acres from various places. So, the next time we go up, which is probably going to be next Thursday, we'll be taking posts, steel posts, and putting them across places that are entrance possibilities. The gates at the north end and the south end are wonderful. That's helped, but there's cunning people who like to go around that. So we're working at it. I was very pleased to be there. It gives one a little confidence to know that this might have a potential for a whole natural area that would start at the north end of Rantoul and go up all the way to Paxton and perhaps even yet to Buckley and Loda, where there are two, Paxton and Loda have cemetery prairies, and then on to Onagar and Gilman. And I still hope that might one day be a eco-tourists. You take them off at Kankakee and have them come south to Rantoul and get back onto 57 there. And perhaps other things we could do on a north-south trail through the state, or trace. Perhaps even could start in Canada and finish in New Orleans, or even in the Gulf itself, where we're destroying the Gulf by putting too much nitrogen down there and oil rigs that leak and problems that affect a very interesting ecosystem. We lost the high school at Paxton, which we thought might be an interesting visitor center. That's part of doing some of these things is they don't always win. You hope. The roadside prairie all the way to Paxton, where there's another moraine, is a prime candidate for roadside development and a trail that stops at Paxton. So after Paxton, it gets narrower, but still the roadside parallel to the railroad line. Between the two is good native prairie. It needs a lot of tender loving care to put it into action. You have to get rid of the autumn olives and all the other curd species and help the plants that are there to survive. If you're on top of the moraine, there's the dry spots. And you have the liatris there might only be 10 inches high, whereas the liatris on the low terrain might be 4 and 5 feet high. Just you see the difference as you go up the hill, and this should be pointed out. So a wonderful sight, and I was pleased to be there, and so was Ron Sleater. We'll be up there again. It's not a place where we take a lot of people yet, but sometimes we do have 50 students. That's a little bit much at once, but they get an introduction to their heritage prairie if they're locals, but if they're people from other countries, they get to understand what the heritage prairie was here. It had not too many trees, and we do have cottonwoods, and they're huge, some of them. Cottonwoods have deep roots. They can get down into an aquifer when it's drought, and they can handle dampness. And we have quite a little grove of cottonwoods, and they're inundated with water at the present time. If you walk around there, you slosh in your boots. So enough. We were pleased to communicate with the cemetery people. We're not always there at the same time as they're there. It's a Moan territory, but it's loaded with history of military people and as well as the early settlers. There's Mr. Crane, and Mr. Crane owns the land on top of the moraine, and Mr. Crane, in his the family's early years, had a large number of children. So there's stones set in a row that indicate the size of the family. So someone who is interested in rural sociology can find it in that cemetery. Okay, I want to say something about Allen Park. I have I've had occasion lately to talk to people about attempts we made to get a visitor centre. I got intrigued and interested in Allerton Park, and it's a wonderful retreat. Much of it was found. It was bought by Sam Allerton, who was in the Civil War, was providing food for the Union Army, and so he had enough money to buy Allerton Park and farmland around it. And he gave it to his son, and he used it as a retreat, and eventually gave it to the university. So there's some farmland which is coming back. It's again regrowth succession. It's coming back into nature. And there was a big area of prairie behind the Prairie house. The Prairie house was a house where the farm manager used to live, and that's where currently orchestras come to play, and it's an attractive music center. And the barn is the center. Well, in it there, the WILL, the radio station, used to have a tower. They had several towers to broadcast from, and they eventually closed out and went to a tower that is more a point tower held in place by guy wires. The building that went with the radio station was there and empty, and there was no visitor center. There's more of a visitor center at Allerton these days, but this was quite some time ago. I'd been taking film of the area, the uplands and the bottomlands, and I was aware that one of the farm areas had been planted in prairie. There was a Professor Hoffman who used to watch the forest that was around this prairie site come back into the prairie. If you know your prairie ecology, you'll know that if you burn a prairie, the trees are not as happy with that, and they back off. And that if you don't burn, the forest will come forward. So there were a number of people who had theses on that area, and it included animal people. So I have the remnants of a bunch of rat traps, which was to catch squirrels and other creatures, so that this area has been, it's on the east or northeast side of Allerton Park, and it's the conservation area. It has a road around it. It's not used very often, but this road ran right around the park, and so I can remember encountering a rattlesnake there that had come out of the prairie, and just there's so there's nature blooming, and the areas around the bottomlands are interesting too, because there's rookery there, and you can stand on the cliff, and a little bit of morainic material to make a cliff, and it's not made, it's nature, and you can see the nests of the herons that are there. There's uplands and lowlands, and I was very aware that there was a tower still at the WILL station. It was enough that it also had parking lots for semi-trailers. There was, there still is pump places for getting water. And I thought this was kind of a nice retreat for a visitor center. It might still be. It has a nice little road into it. You get to it at that stage. You got to it through a line of Norway spruce, and these Norway spruce had branches that went right down to the road and onto the road. Eventually, the low uh, areas got popsicleized, so the bottom branches are now cut off, and you can still see that row of spruce. And opposite was access to the natural area. So we got to work with that. Walter Keith was the person in charge, and he permitted us to get hold of a bunch of chairs and some audiovisual equipment, overhead projectors that came out of the Army, and we gradually set up a sort of rough, tough visitor center. Uh, then the next thing is we would like to see the difference between the uplands and the lowlands. We didn't have any drones to send over the Sangamon River at that time. The only way you got to see it was from a small plane, or you could climb the antenna. So I can remember climbing up the antenna, no electricity anymore, no broadcast equipment, and my evil intent there was to put platforms on the different sections as it went up and got smaller, so that people could, and put the stairwells in, so people could climb up and eventually look over the river. So I climbed up with a Bill and Hal movie camera, which was fairly heavy. And I'm very aware that if you climb heights that you're not used to, it can be dangerous because you daren't look down or to climb down. So I was doing okay. I got up to the point where I thought it was wouldn't be useful. You'd have to take off the top. And so I have some film around somewhere that is taken from the top of that tower, and you can very definitely see the lowland trees are still green when the fall trees were in their fall. This was late in the year, and so I was so excited about that. I had a grad student that drew up a plan for utilizing this tower, and then then it was decided that this was a liability. Even Monk could have fallen off of it. So they had a demolition person put a bomb under each of the legs of the aerial, of the antenna, and they felled the antenna, and the house was somewhat destroyed. We were given that notice to take our equipment out and did so. That was kind of sad. Just as we were working with some of the remnants of this, a person came along, and he and his wife had spent their honeymoon putting that antenna up. It was a tall antenna. It was probably not 200 feet, but it fell all the way up to the next door road. And they had spent their honeymoon erecting this, probably with other people too, this antenna. And he told me that they do this out west. They make these antennas into fire inspection areas, and they do what I was wanting to do. They put a ladder in so that people can climb up, and they probably put a little house on the top so they could watch for fires. In those days, people protected forests from fires, not realizing that forests like to be burned too, and so the Smokey the Bear has changed these days, and we tend to want to burn prairies and burn forests. And he was a little sad that it had come down, and he understood that. So the visitor center complex disappeared, and but it's still in my mind that that could be a little nature center. It's over the other side of the river from the house, so most of the visitor experiences with the house and around with the 4-H center, and but it's interesting. The 4-H center had families that came, and the families had children and they had grandchildren, and they came for years and years. Eventually, it was thought that this was a little bit odd. But you have people who live in Monticello, near to Allerton Park now, who are there because they came with their children to the 4-H camp, and that's still used in the same way. The farmland has been separated from the house area, and that is, it used to be run by the agronomy department, the university farm organization would be in charge. That's what Mr. Preby was a part of that. But it's now farmed out, and some of the complex that a little elevator and farm storage bins and farm buildings have been taken out because there's a bun rush to get a little bit more 15 acres for corn and soybeans. On the other hand, the university has been quite interested. We have a railroad line that goes, a railroad bed that goes right past. And Fran Hardy, who has been a regional director for the Department of Natural Resources and now is in the Nature Conservancy, worked with the university and convinced them to give 65 feet by a mile adjacent to a railroad line to encourage rattlesnakes. Somebody had run over a rattlesnake. It didn't have any live rattlesnakes yet, but the habitat is good. And the other side of the conservation side of Allerton does have rattlesnakes. So they weren't brought there by Allerton. They were native, and they're part of the ecosystem. So that railroad bed could be a trail, but we're very jealous of it because it has on its 100-foot wide right of way enough nature to let people know what a prairie was. So we've been cautious. We had a chance to put a wide trail in, but we're not into wide trails because wide trails really take out a lot of the prairie that's come up onto the railroad ballast. The prairie sorts itself out. The dry species like to be on the dry gravel of the ballast, and the more moist species like to be in a gutter, and even the roadside species sort themselves out. The chicory likes it a little bit drier. The Queen Anne's lace can be a little lower, and you can take a photograph of the road in summertime, and you can see even the roadside plants that get mown are sorting themselves out according to their own ecology. We have an overdose of autumn olives there, and some Canada thistle, but we hope that in the long run, that along with places like the Pope Prairie and Rantoul will have a continuing population of people that really care about those sites. There are 3 bridges, and you can stand on the bridges and look at little streams like Wildcat Creek, and another one, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's near to Cisco, and you can see the native meanders, and you can see how the water carves it on one side and makes a little beach on the other side, and so it happens to be in farm fields, so it's mown enough that you can actually see what's going on, whereas if it was native, you probably wouldn't recognize the meanders doing their work. Nearby, there's a hog chute bridge. And the Hogshoe Bridge, all the steel bridges were put in the 1860s, 70s, whatever, and they're big enough for a horse and dray and farm equipment of that era, but they're a menace these days for huge combine harvesters and planters that you have to go 7 mile around because they can't go across these bridges. So the bridge at behind Cisco and behind Allerton Park was in jeopardy some. It had been repaired with new planking, so there was resources there, but there was enough money to put together a concrete bridge which is done not like a truss bridge with iron going over the top. It was open and the sides were low enough that you could put a modern piece of equipment across it. So a new bridge was put in, and we were hoping and hoping that this bridge would remain as a feature of that area. Right nearby was a farm owned by the Kirby Hospital. There's quite a few farms that are a part of the Kirby Hospital. But there's an embankment there, which is part of glaciation, Cerro Gordo moraine in this case. And it has wildflowers there you can't believe. It has bellflowers in it. There's things you don't get other places. And there's this area where there's enough water that you can canoe. And there was a hotel there. It was before the era of motels, and it was probably more recent than the era of having little cabins that you stayed in. And it was sort of a country club. And all sorts of stories revolve around the country club. So it's an interesting territory, and people still do live in it. And a nice little road into it. And we got together people to try and save the Hogshoe Bridge. The Hogshoe Bridge could be spelled in two ways. It could be shoot, Shoot, where you have to know that people harvested pigs hogs that were in the river bottoms, and often it was the hogs that were a little less than brilliant or a little less than a size, so they were allowed to roam around on the river bottoms. Well, shoot, you could gather up a hog and shoot it. So that would be the one way of using the term shoot. The other way was quite different, and this is how it was used. A truck was put up on one end of the Hogshoe Bridge, Chute, and that chute was a chute. It's like if you're going to take stone off a roof and send it down to a dumpster, you use a chute. Well, this was a chute. You rounded up your hogs, and when you want to take them to market, and you used the bridge as a chute to round up the hogs. You do the same thing if it was cattle or sheep. It's a Chute. Well, it got to be Christmas time, and the cranes were there. The cranes had been putting in the new bridge, I think, at the same time. And there were people who wanted the planks and wanted the steel. And eventually the Hogshoe Bridge came down. And that was kind of sad because it's behind Allerton, and you could take a bicycle around or a car around behind Allerton and go toward the house. It's a different route. It goes by Willow Branch and some of the conservation size lost gardens where there were statues, and some they've been removed because of vandalism. But this is a complex that we should revere, and I think the state is interested in doing something about it. They've been wanting to have the house to be more prone to providing for big weddings or big venues, and so there's moves afoot at the state level as well as at the university level and the local level, Monticello, which relates to all this, to expand the house and somehow get a different population of visitors in a nice fashion. Monticello is an interesting place, and it has used to have a Pepsin factory, and it has a railroad museum, and it has Lodge Park and an old historic courthouse center, and just a welter of things that are nice tourism. People can come and find out who you are and what you do and why you do it. And add our railroad bed where there's 2 miles of trail. And just this week in the newspaper, the second segment of a 2-mile rail stretch that went over the segment on a truss bridge that we bought this for. We bought it for trails as well as the prairie and perhaps the rail if necessary. So the city itself is putting $63,480 into a contract to have that second segment, which is sort of by popular request. It'll be concreted. It's easier to maintain concrete if you can do it locally. If you do it in asphalt, it's going to be bringing in equipment that is hard to deal with. I'm going to quiet because there's still a few moments left when we can put in a WEFT promo. We're very lucky to work with WEFT and to have the Banner Public Television and Jason Liggett and others working with us to be able to present you with a little story here and there. It's not always perfect, but as the archivists remind us at the Banner Free Library, don't worry if it's not perfect. You can always add to it later. But if you let it go into the dumpster, that story will be gone forever. So please remember that there is a library at Monticello. There's a library at they're having an argument at the moment about State Street, which the Pepsin factory created, and the Atkins family, I think, bought the Pepsin Hill where the factory was taken down. But I would like them to put in apartments or other things that are roughly equivalent to this national level sequence of economic development, where you have entrepreneurs finding a Pepsin, and then it goes to a drop process where you add all the equipment together. Then it closes out because these days you have a continuous process, but it's still, the product is produced as Pepto-Bismol. That's enough. This is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And stay well.